The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace as Officer James Harrison adjusted his bearskin cap and took his position. At 28, he carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from 6 years of dedicated service in the Queen's Guard. His polished boots gleamed in the early light, and his red ceremonial uniform stood crisp against the palace's weathered stone walls. Tourists were already gathering, their excited chatter and camera clicks creating a familiar background noise he'd grown accustomed to over the years. A young child waved at him enthusiastically from behind the barrier, and while Harrison maintained his stern expression, he felt a familiar warmth in his chest. These moments reminded him why he loved his job. He wasn't just a guard, he was part of living history. Harrison's journey to the Queen's Guard hadn't been easy. Growing up in South London, he'd always dreamed of serving in the military, inspired by his grandfather who'd served in World War II. Through years of rigorous training and unwavering determination, he'd earned his place among the elite guards, proving himself through countless drills and ceremonies. As the morning crowd grew larger, Harrison began his ceremonial walk, each step measured and precise. His movements were a testament to the hundreds of hours spent perfecting this routine. Tourists watched in awe as he performed the traditional guard change, his actions flowing with mechanical precision while maintaining a distinctly human grace. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip pressed against the barrier, their teacher explaining the significance of the Queen's Guard. Harrison could hear snippets of her explanation about the Guard's role in protecting the royal family and upholding centuries of tradition. He remembered being their age, looking up at the Guards with the same wonder these children now showed. The summer heat was beginning to build, and beads of sweat formed under his heavy uniform. Yet Harrison remained motionless at his post, his discipline unwavering. Years of training had taught him to handle all kinds of weather conditions, from scorching summer days to freezing winter mornings. The weight of his rifle, the pressure of his boots, and the scratch of his wool uniform had become second nature. Around mid-morning, a tour guide stopped near his post with a large group, explaining the history of the Queen's Guard. Harrison listened as she told the story of how the Guards had protected the palace through 2 world wars and countless other challenges. It filled him with pride to be part of this legacy, to stand where so many brave men and women had stood before. His thoughts drifted to his family as he maintained his watch. His mother had been so proud when he'd first worn this uniform, tears in her eyes as she straightened his collar. His father, usually quiet and reserved, had pulled him into a tight hug that day. They understood the significance of their son becoming part of such a prestigious institution. The clouds shifted overhead, changing the patterns of light that played across the palace grounds. Harrison observed the ebb and flow of visitors, keeping a vigilant eye while maintaining his statuesque pose. Each person who passed by was carefully noted, a skill that came from years of security training combined with natural instinct. A street performer nearby started playing God Save the Queen on a violin, adding a fitting soundtrack to the scene. The melody carried across the courtyard, reminding Harrison of his first parade as a guard, when the anthem had filled him with such emotion he'd nearly broken his stern expression. As the morning wore on, Harrison remained alert, knowing that maintaining security while being a tourist attraction required a delicate balance. He was more than just a photo opportunity. He was a highly trained soldier, ready to respond to any situation at a moment's notice. Little did he know that his training and composure would soon be put to the test in ways he never expected. The peaceful morning atmosphere outside Buckingham Palace shifted as the afternoon crowds grew thicker. Officer Harrison noticed a change in the air, something that his years of experience had taught him to recognize. Among the cheerful tourists and excited children, one man stood out for all the wrong reasons. Richard Kent, a middle-aged tourist from Liverpool, was swaying slightly as he walked, his face flushed from what was clearly too many midday drinks. His loud voice carried across the courtyard, drawing unwanted attention. At first, he was just another rowdy visitor, the kind the guards dealt with regularly. But something about his demeanor set off warning bells in Harrison's mind. A young couple nearby pulled their children closer as Kent's voice grew louder. His words became increasingly inappropriate, making several tourists visibly uncomfortable. A group of Japanese visitors quietly moved away, their excited photo-taking replaced by concerned glances. The cheerful atmosphere that had prevailed all morning began to evaporate like morning dew under a harsh sun. An elderly gentleman in a tweed jacket stepped forward, trying to reason with Kent. "Come now, my good man," he said softly, "there's no need for such behavior." But Kent merely scoffed, his face growing redder as he continued his unseemly display. The older man's kindness was met with a stream of unpleasant words that made nearby parents cover their children's ears. Two American tourists, a husband and wife, who'd been eagerly photographing the palace, lowered their cameras. The husband, a tall man in a bright Hawaiian shirt, pulled out his phone and began recording, sensing that something newsworthy was unfolding. Others followed suit, their phones capturing what was quickly becoming an unfortunate scene for posterity. A palace tour guide, who had been explaining the history of the royal guards to her group, paused mid-sentence. She'd seen countless tourists come and go, but something about this situation felt different. She quietly directed her group to move further away, her experienced eyes noting the growing tension. Harrison remained perfectly still, as his training demanded, but his senses were on high alert. Through years of service, he'd developed an almost sixth sense for trouble, and right now every instinct was telling him to be ready. His peripheral vision tracked Kent's increasingly erratic movements while maintaining his ceremonial stance. A young security officer in plain clothes approached Kent, trying to defuse the situation. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice and step back," he said professionally. But Kent's response was to become even more belligerent, his words slurring together as he pointed accusingly at the guard post. More phones were raised now, recording the unfolding scene. Social media would later light up with these videos, but in the moment, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Tourist families began to edge away, their excited vacation photos forgotten in the face of mounting unpleasantness. Other visitors showed their character in different ways. A grandmother pulled her grandson close, quietly explaining that sometimes people make poor choices, and it's important to learn from their mistakes. A group of students who had been taking selfies now stood sullenly, their young faces showing concern for the situation developing before them. The tourist crowd had naturally divided into two groups, those moving away from the scene, and those who felt compelled to witness what was happening. The divide created a sort of impromptu arena, with Kent at its center, his behavior becoming increasingly problematic with each passing moment. As the situation escalated, the air seemed to grow heavier with anticipation. Harrison's training ran through his mind like a well-rehearsed script, the protocols, the procedures, the proper responses to various scenarios. Yet he knew that sometimes reality doesn't follow the script, and he needed to be prepared for anything. Little did anyone know that this tense moment was just the prelude to what would become a viral incident that would spark discussions across the nation. The situation outside Buckingham Palace reached its breaking point as Kent, stumbling slightly, made the fateful decision to cross the barrier. The metal barrier clattered as he pushed past it, the sound cutting through the tense atmosphere like a knife. Several tourists gasped, their phones still recording what was quickly becoming a serious security breach. Officer Harrison's training kicked into high gear. Years of drills and protocols crystallized into razor-sharp focus as he tracked Kent's movements without breaking his ceremonial stance. The weight of his rifle felt more pronounced now, a reminder of the serious responsibility he carried. His mind raced through the proper procedures while maintaining the outward calm that the Queen's Guard was famous for. A mother quickly pulled her young son back, whispering urgently to him about staying safe. The boy's eyes were wide as he watched the scene unfold, clutching his small toy guard figure tightly. Nearby, an off-duty police officer began moving through the crowd, speaking quietly into his phone, clearly alerting the authorities to the escalating situation. The palace tour guide who had earlier moved her group away was now actively coordinating with other guides to create a safety corridor, their years of experience showing in their calm but firm directions to visitors. "Please step back," they urged, their voices steady despite the tension. "Make room for security." Kent's footsteps echoed on the cobblestones as he approached Harrison's post. The summer air felt thick with tension, and the usual tourist chatter had died down to nervous whispers. Even the pigeons that usually pecked around the courtyard had scattered, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. The plainclothes security officer who had tried to reason with Kent earlier was now speaking urgently into his radio, his free hand held out in a stopping motion. "Sir, this is your final warning," he called out, his voice carrying across the now quiet courtyard. "Return behind the barrier immediately." But Kent was beyond listening to reason. His face was contorted with misplaced anger as he continued his approach, ignoring the multiple warnings. The crowd watched in disbelief as he deliberately stepped into Harrison's ceremonial walk path, a serious breach of both protocol and common sense. Time seemed to slow down as Harrison completed his current patrol step. His boots clicked against the stone with military precision, each movement deliberate and measured despite the chaos unfolding around him. The sun caught the brass buttons of his uniform as he came to his next position, the ceremony of centuries of tradition meeting modern-day reality. A group of schoolchildren who had been excited to see the guards now huddled behind their teachers, their young faces showing a mix of fear and fascination. Their teachers formed a protective circle around them, turning what had been an educational trip into an impromptu lesson about safety and respect. The air crackled with tension as Kent made his final approach. Harrison's voice rang out, clear and authoritative. "Stand back from the Queen's Guard." The warning, delivered with parade ground precision, echoed off the palace walls. It was the standard caution, a tradition that had been maintained for generations, but now carried an unmistakable edge of urgency. Some tourists had begun to edge away, sensing the impending confrontation, while others remained rooted to the spot, their phones still recording. The division in the crowd created an eerie corridor of space around Harrison's post, like the eye of a storm. In those final moments before everything changed, Harrison thought of his training, his duty, and the responsibility he carried. He was more than just a ceremonial figure. He was a highly trained soldier tasked with protecting one of Britain's most important institutions. As Kent raised his hands in a threatening gesture, Harrison knew that the next few seconds would test everything he had learned in his years of service. Officer Harrison's warning echoed across the palace grounds, but Kent showed no signs of backing down. Time seemed to slow as Harrison's military training took over, each movement calculated and precise. The crowd held its collective breath, phones still recording what was about to become a viral moment. Kent's attempted shove came as if in slow motion. Harrison, with the fluid grace of someone who had trained for years for such moments, sidestepped the clumsy attack. His movements were controlled and professional, using just enough force to protect himself while maintaining the dignity of his position. The rifle in his hands stayed steady, never used as a weapon, but held with the same ceremonial precision as always. A young tourist from Canada later described the scene as like watching a dance, but one where you could feel the tension in the air. Harrison's response was textbook perfect, a demonstration of the hours spent in training sessions, learning how to handle difficult situations with minimal force. His actions were defensive rather than aggressive, showing remarkable restraint despite the provocation. The plainclothes security officer, who had been monitoring the situation, rushed forward, now joined by two uniformed police officers who had been patrolling nearby. They moved with practiced efficiency, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones as they converged on the scene. Harrison had already managed to secure Kent in a hold that was firm but careful, giving the officers time to take control of the situation. Tourists watched in amazement as Harrison maintained his composure throughout the entire incident. Even while restraining Kent, his posture remained professional, his uniform still crisp and neat. It was a testament to the rigorous standards of the Queen's Guard that even in this extreme situation, protocol was followed to the letter. The grandmother who had been teaching her grandson about good behavior earlier was heard telling him, "See how the guard handled that without losing his temper. That's what real strength looks like." Her words carried across the suddenly quiet courtyard, drawing nods of agreement from nearby visitors. As the police officers took custody of Kent, Harrison smoothly returned to his ceremonial stance. The transition was so seamless that some tourists who had just arrived weren't even aware of what had transpired moments before. The only signs of the confrontation were the murmuring crowd and the slightly displaced barrier that security staff were now repositioning. A middle-aged teacher from Birmingham, who happened to be visiting with his family, was overheard saying to his children, "That's why we respect the guards. They're not just here for show, they're trained soldiers doing an important job." His words seemed to resonate with many in the crowd, who nodded in agreement. The whole incident had lasted less than 2 minutes, but its impact was immediate and far-reaching. Phones that had recorded the scene were already uploading videos to social media platforms. The hashtag Royal Guard Professional would soon start trending, with people praising Harrison's measured response and exemplary conduct. The summer sun continued to shine down on the palace grounds as normal tourist activities slowly resumed. Harrison maintained his watch, his dedication unwavering. If anything, his stance seemed even more dignified now, earning respectful nods from passing visitors who had witnessed his professionalism in action. A small child, probably no more than 6 years old, gave Harrison a thumbs up from behind the newly straightened barrier. Though he maintained his stern expression, internally Harrison felt a sense of pride, not in subduing Kent, but in upholding the high standards of the Queen's Guard while ensuring everyone's safety. As the afternoon wore on, the incident became the talk of the palace grounds. Tourists who arrived later heard different versions from those who had witnessed it, but all accounts agreed on one thing. The Queen's Guard had demonstrated why they were considered among the best-trained soldiers in the world. Harrison's response had shown that beneath the ceremonial uniform was a highly skilled professional, ready to handle any situation while maintaining the dignity of his position. Within hours of the incident, videos of Officer Harrison's professional response began spreading across social media like wildfire. A young student's shaky phone footage was the first to go viral, quickly followed by clearer versions from different angles. The clips showed the whole scene, from Kent's inappropriate behavior to Harrison's measured response, and the internet had found its newest hero. The palace gift shop, usually quiet in the late afternoon, was buzzing with activity as tourists discussed what they'd witnessed. A retired military officer who had seen everything unfold was explaining to a group of interested visitors how Harrison's response reflected the exceptional training of the Queen's Guard. "That's years of discipline on display," he said, pointing to where Harrison still stood at his post, as professional as ever. News vans began appearing outside the palace gates, their satellite dishes reaching up into the darkening sky. Reporters spoke in hushed tones into their microphones, careful not to disturb the now peaceful scene. One veteran journalist was overheard saying it was the most dignified handling of a security threat she'd seen in 20 years of covering royal news. On social media, the hashtag Queen's Guard Professional and hashtag Royal Guard Respect were trending worldwide. People shared the videos alongside messages of support for Harrison and condemnation of the inappropriate behavior they'd witnessed. A popular cooking show host even tweeted, "Now that's what I call keeping your cool under pressure. Respect to our Queen's Guard." The tourist who had recorded the clearest version of the incident, an amateur photographer from Australia, found his inbox flooded with requests from news organizations. His video, which captured Harrison's warning and Kent's aggressive response in perfect detail, would later be used in police training sessions as an example of professional restraint in action. Back at the palace, the atmosphere had transformed. Tourists who arrived later in the day found an almost reverent mood, with visitors speaking in whispers as they passed Harrison's post. Many took photos, but now they did so with visible respect, maintaining their distance from the barrier without being told. A group of veterans visiting from Canada paused to salute as they walked by, a gesture of professional respect that spoke volumes. Harrison maintained his stoic expression, but those who looked closely might have noticed his posture become even more precise, honoring their acknowledgement while staying true to his duties. Local food vendors near the palace found themselves serving as impromptu news sources, sharing what they'd seen with curious visitors. A sandwich shop owner who had witnessed the whole thing told his customers, "Been here 15 years, never seen anything like it. That guard did us proud today." Parents used the incident as a teaching moment for their children. A father was overheard explaining to his young daughter, sometimes being brave means staying calm when others aren't. "That guard showed us what that looks like today." His words carried across the courtyard, drawing thoughtful nods from other tourists. As evening approached, palace security had their hands full managing the increased crowd of onlookers who hoped to catch a glimpse of the now famous guard. Regular visitors noticed more police presence than usual, though they maintained a discreet distance, their presence reassuring rather than intrusive. The elderly gentleman who had tried to reason with Kent earlier in the day returned briefly, making his way through the crowd to speak with a police officer. He wanted to provide his contact information as a witness, his sense of civic duty evident in his determined expression. "We must support those who protect us," he was heard saying firmly. By nightfall, as Harrison's shift came to an end, the story had made its way onto evening news broadcasts across the country. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from a young boy who had watched the whole thing unfold. As he left the palace grounds with his family, he turned to his mother and said, "When I grow up, I want to be that brave." His simple words captured what many were feeling, that they had witnessed not just an incident, but an example of grace under pressure that would be remembered for years to come. The wheels of justice turned swiftly in the days following the incident at Buckingham Palace. Kent found himself in a small courtroom, the gravity of his actions finally sinking in as he faced the magistrate. The viral videos that had captured his behavior played on screens around the world, but here in court they served as clear evidence of his misconduct. The courthouse corridors buzzed with quiet conversation as journalists and members of the public gathered for the hearing. A court sketch artist captured Kent's changed demeanor. Gone was the aggressive swagger, replaced by a slumped posture and evident regret. His lawyer, a seasoned public defender, stood beside him, looking through papers with a furrowed brow. The prosecution presented a compelling case, methodically laying out the events of that day. They showed multiple video angles, each one drawing quiet murmurs from the packed courtroom. The tourist from Australia, who had captured the clearest footage, gave his testimony via video link, his account matching perfectly with the visual evidence. A police officer who had responded to the scene testified about Kent's behavior during the arrest. "In my 20 years of service," she stated firmly, "I've rarely seen such a clear case of unprovoked harassment." Her words carried weight, especially when she described how Officer Harrison had maintained his professionalism throughout the incident. The elderly gentleman who had tried to intervene that day also appeared as a witness. His testimony was particularly moving as he described how Kent had ignored multiple attempts to calm the situation. "It was clear to everyone present that his behavior was completely unacceptable," he said, his voice steady and clear. Kent's employer had already taken action before the court proceedings began. The marketing firm where he had worked as a mid-level manager released a statement distancing themselves from his actions and announcing his immediate termination. "We have zero tolerance for such behavior," their statement read, reflecting the widespread public condemnation. During the proceedings, the court heard from a palace security expert who explained the importance of respecting the barriers and guidelines around the Queen's Guard. His testimony helped the magistrate understand the seriousness of breaching these security protocols, adding another layer to the charges Kent faced. The defense tried to argue that alcohol had impaired Kent's judgment, but the magistrate was unmoved. "Being under the influence does not excuse such behavior," she stated firmly. "If anything, it adds to the seriousness of your actions." Her words resonated through the hushed courtroom. Local community leaders attended the hearing, their presence underlining the case's significance. A respected civil rights advocate spoke to reporters during a break, emphasizing how the case highlighted the need for continued vigilance against discriminatory behavior in all its forms. The sentence, when it came, sent a clear message: 6 months in prison, a substantial fine, and a ban from approaching Buckingham Palace. The magistrate's words were crystal clear. "This behavior has no place in our society, and the consequences must reflect that." She particularly noted Harrison's professional response as a stark contrast to Kent's actions. Kent's family sat quietly at the back of the courtroom, their faces showing a mix of embarrassment and resignation. His sister later spoke briefly to reporters, apologizing on behalf of the family and expressing hope that her brother would use this time to reflect and change. As word of the sentence spread outside the courthouse, the public reaction was overwhelmingly positive. A retired judge commented to a news crew that the punishment struck the right balance, firm enough to send a message, but also allowing for rehabilitation. The case would go on to be cited in legal textbooks as an example of how the justice system can effectively respond to public incidents of harassment. The incident at Buckingham Palace sparked changes that reached far beyond the palace gates. 3 months after that summer day, Officer Harrison stood at his post, watching a new generation of guards training nearby. The military had updated its protocols, using his experience as a template for handling similar situations with professional restraint. The palace grounds had seen subtle but significant changes. New signs explained the history and importance of the Queen's Guard, helping visitors understand that behind the ceremonial uniforms were highly trained soldiers. Tourist guides now included a specific section about respecting the guards and maintaining proper distance from the barriers. A documentary filmmaker captured these changes while working on a piece about palace traditions. Her interviews with visitors revealed a deeper appreciation for the guards' role. They're not just there for photos, one tourist from Japan explained through a translator. They're real soldiers protecting an important part of history. Harrison's handling of the incident became required viewing at police academies and military training centers. Instructors used the video to demonstrate the perfect balance of restraint and authority. Notice how he maintains his composure throughout, a veteran instructor would point out. That's the standard we aim for. The Palace Gift Shop added a new book about the Queen's Guard, written by a military historian. The chapter about Harrison's incident ended with a powerful quote from a fellow guard. "We stand for tradition, but we also stand for respect." That day showed both. The book became an unexpected bestseller, especially popular with young readers interested in military service. Local schools began including the incident in their citizenship classes, using it to discuss respect, duty, and proper behavior. A primary school teacher shared how her students were particularly impressed by Harrison's calm response. They understand now that real strength isn't about aggression, it's about control and dignity, she explained during a teachers' conference. Social media continued to play a role in spreading the positive message. A year after the incident, the hashtag Show Respect Like the Guard was trending, with people sharing stories of maintaining composure in difficult situations. One viral post came from a bus driver who credited Harrison's example for helping him handle a challenging passenger with patience and professionalism. Harrison himself remained humble about his role in these changes. When asked about the incident during a rare authorized interview, he simply said, "I was doing my duty just as any of my colleagues would have done." His words reflected the modest professionalism that had made his actions so impressive in the first place. The palace grounds saw another touching moment when a group of veterans organized a special ceremony to honor the Queen's Guard. Among them was the elderly gentleman who had tried to intervene that day. He presented a plaque commemorating the Guard's dedication to duty, which now hangs discreetly in the Guard's quarters. Tourist behavior around the palace showed noticeable improvement. Guards reported fewer instances of visitors crossing barriers or acting disrespectfully. A palace administrator noted that people seemed to better understand the dual nature of the Guard's role, maintaining tradition while providing real security. The incident's impact reached beyond Britain's borders. Military units from other countries studied the response as an example of excellent training and self-control. A Canadian military officer visiting the palace commented, "This has become a textbook example of how to handle provocation while maintaining dignity." As the story became part of palace lore, it served as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes come from moments of challenge, met with grace and professionalism. Harrison continued his duties, his upright posture and unwavering dedication inspiring a new generation to understand that true strength lies not in aggression, but in the dignity with which we face life's challenges.